Have you ever wondered why history feels like it was written by men for men? Why, when you flip through any medieval textbook, you see endless pages of kings and knights, bishops and scholars, but barely a whisper about the women who lived, loved and fought alongside them for 500 years? Well, here's the thing that will blow your mind. Women weren't just sitting quietly in towers waiting to be rescued. They were running kingdoms, leading armies, building empires, and shaping the very foundations of our modern world. But their stories were systematically erased, buried under centuries of male-dominated narratives that painted them as nothing more than pretty ornaments in a man's world. Today, I'm going to shatter that myth completely. We're diving deep into 5 centuries of medieval history to uncover the incredible women who changed everything. And trust me, by the end of this series, you'll never look at the Middle Ages the same way again. Because what I'm about to show you isn't just history. It's a revolution that's been hiding in plain sight for over 1,000 years. But before we jump in, let me tell you why this matters so much. For too long, we've been fed this sanitized version of medieval life where women existed only as wives, mothers, or nuns, where their entire existence revolved around serving men and staying silent. But that's not just wrong. It's a massive lie that's robbed us of understanding how incredibly complex and powerful medieval women actually were. I've spent the last 2 years digging through archives, analysing primary sources, and working with medieval historians to piece together the real story. What I found will shock you. These women weren't victims of their time. They were master strategists, brilliant politicians, fierce warriors, and innovative leaders who navigated one of the most brutal periods in human history with intelligence and strength that would put most modern leaders to shame. So buckle up, because we're about to embark on a journey that will completely transform how you see medieval history. We're talking about empresses who controlled vast territories, abbesses who wielded more power than kings, merchants who built international trading empires, and rebels who sparked revolutions that echoed through centuries. The story begins in the year 1000, right at the dawn of what we call the High Middle Ages. Picture this. Europe is emerging from the chaos of the early medieval period. Viking raids are still terrorizing coastlines. The Holy Roman Empire is flexing its muscles across Central Europe, and the Catholic Church is consolidating power like never before. It's a world of constant warfare, political intrigue, and social upheaval. Most history books will tell you this was a man's world. They'll paint you a picture of armored knights charging into battle, while women cowered in castles, praying for their safe return. But here's what they don't tell you. Behind every powerful medieval man was often an even more powerful woman pulling the strings. Take Theophanu, the Byzantine princess who became Holy Roman Empress in 972. While her husband Otto II was off fighting wars, she was the one actually running the empire. She made crucial diplomatic decisions, managed the imperial treasury, and when Otto died unexpectedly, she didn't step aside like a good medieval woman was supposed to. Instead, she seized control as regent for her young son and ruled the Holy Roman Empire with an iron fist for 7 years. But Theophanu wasn't unique. She was part of a pattern that historians have been ignoring for centuries. Medieval women consistently found ways to accumulate and exercise real political power, even in a system designed to exclude them. They just had to be more creative about it. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval women's lives: the art of indirect power. While men fought with swords and armies, women mastered the subtle arts of influence, negotiation, and strategic alliance building. They turned marriage into a political weapon, transformed religious institutions into power bases, and used their roles as mothers and wives to shape the destiny of nations. Consider the marriage politics of the medieval period. Every royal wedding was essentially a military alliance disguised as a romantic ceremony. And guess who was often the mastermind behind these strategic unions? The women of the court. Queens and noble ladies spent their lives building intricate networks of family connections that could be activated in times of crisis. They were like medieval chess masters, thinking 10 moves ahead while everyone else was focused on the immediate battle. The economic power of medieval women is another story that's been criminally underreported. In towns and cities across Europe, women were running businesses, controlling trade routes, and accumulating wealth that would make modern entrepreneurs jealous. The textile industry, one of the most profitable sectors of the medieval economy, was dominated by women from top to bottom. They controlled everything from the production of raw materials to the international trade networks that distributed finished goods across continents. But perhaps nowhere was women's hidden power more evident than in the religious sphere. The medieval Catholic Church might have preached about women's supposed inferiority, but in practice, abbesses wielded enormous influence. They controlled vast estates, commanded armies of nuns and lay workers, and often had direct access to kings and emperors. Some abbesses were so powerful that they minted their own coins and maintained their own military forces. Hildegard of Bingen stands out as perhaps the most remarkable example of medieval women's intellectual power. This 12th century Benedictine abbess wasn't just a religious figure. She was a composer whose music is still performed today, a philosopher whose writings influenced medieval thought for centuries, a scientist whose medical knowledge was centuries ahead of her time, and a political advisor whose counsel was sought by emperors and popes. What makes Hildegard's story so incredible is that she achieved all this while operating within the constraints of medieval society. She couldn't openly challenge male authority, so she claimed her ideas came from divine visions. She couldn't attend universities, so she created her own centers of learning. She couldn't lead armies, so she built networks of influence that were more powerful than any military force. This pattern of creative resistance appears again and again throughout medieval history. Women found ways to circumvent the official restrictions placed on them by developing alternative power structures that operated parallel to the male-dominated hierarchy. They created women-only spaces where they could develop their talents, build alliances, and plan strategies for advancing their interests in the broader society. The crusading period offers some of the most dramatic examples of medieval women seizing unexpected opportunities for power and influence. While their husbands and sons marched off to the Holy Land, many women found themselves suddenly in control of vast territories and resources. Some, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, used these opportunities to launch their own political careers that would span decades and reshape the political landscape of Europe. Eleanor's story is particularly fascinating because it shows how a medieval woman could accumulate power through strategic marriages and then use that power to influence events across multiple kingdoms. She was Queen of France through her first marriage, Queen of England through her second, and the mother of 2 English kings. But more than that, she was a political operator who understood how to use her various roles to maximum advantage. During the Second Crusade, Eleanor didn't stay home and pray for her husband's success like she was supposed to. Instead, she accompanied Louis VII to the Holy Land with her own retinue of noble ladies, essentially creating a parallel command structure that gave women unprecedented influence in military affairs. The chroniclers of the time were scandalized, but Eleanor understood something they didn't. Power unused is power lost. This aggressive pursuit of influence wasn't limited to queens and empresses. Across medieval Europe, women of all social classes were finding ways to expand their sphere of action beyond the traditional domestic realm. Merchant women were establishing international trading networks. Craft women were organizing guilds that protected their economic interests. Peasant women were leading local resistance movements against oppressive lords. The key insight is that medieval women weren't passive victims of a patriarchal system. They were active agents who constantly pushed against the boundaries of what was considered acceptable female behavior. They took risks, made enemies, and often paid steep prices for their ambitions. But they also achieved remarkable things that have been written out of the historical record by later generations of male historians who couldn't imagine women as anything other than supporting characters in men's stories. What we're beginning to understand is that the medieval period wasn't the dark age for women that we've been taught to believe. Yes, women faced significant legal and social restrictions. Yes, they were excluded from many formal positions of power. But within those constraints, they created their own systems of influence and authority that were often more effective than the official male hierarchy. The silence we've been talking about wasn't really silence at all. It was a different kind of voice, one that spoke through actions rather than proclamations, through networks rather than institutions, through influence rather than force. Medieval women developed their own political language, and once you learn to read it, their presence in history becomes impossible to ignore. This political language of medieval women becomes even more fascinating when we examine the religious reformist movements of the 11th and 12th centuries. While male church leaders were busy debating theological doctrine in Latin, women were quietly revolutionizing how ordinary people experienced Christianity. They weren't writing treatises or delivering sermons from pulpits, but they were transforming religious practice from the ground up in ways that would echo through centuries. The Beguine movement represents one of the most remarkable examples of medieval women creating entirely new social structures. These were communities of lay religious women who took vows of chastity and poverty, but remained outside the formal monastic system. What made them revolutionary wasn't just their religious devotion, but the economic independence they achieved. Beguines supported themselves through textile work, teaching, and caring for the sick, creating self-sustaining women-only economies that operated completely outside male control. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. The Beguine communities weren't just surviving, they were thriving. By the 13th century, there were hundreds of these communities across Northern Europe, housing thousands of women who had essentially opted out of traditional medieval society. They owned property, made their own laws, and created their own forms of governance. The Catholic Church and secular authorities didn't know what to make of them because they didn't fit into any existing category. The success of the Beguines reveals something crucial about medieval women's strategies for power. Instead of trying to break into existing male institutions, they created parallel institutions that served their needs better. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout the medieval period. Women couldn't become priests, so they became mystics, whose spiritual authority often exceeded that of the official clergy. They couldn't attend universities, so they established their own centers of learning that were often more innovative than the formal academic institutions. Speaking of innovation, let's talk about the incredible technological and scientific contributions that medieval women made. Contributions that have been almost completely erased from our understanding of medieval progress. While we celebrate male inventors and scholars from this period, we've forgotten the women who were making breakthrough discoveries in medicine, engineering, and natural philosophy. Medieval convents were essentially the research universities of their day, and the women who ran them were conducting some of the most advanced scientific work in Europe. Abbesses maintained extensive libraries, funded translation projects that preserved ancient knowledge, and supported original research in fields ranging from astronomy to agriculture. The famous medical school at Salerno, one of the first institutions in medieval Europe to admit women students, produced female physicians whose medical texts were used throughout Europe for centuries. But even more remarkable were the women who operated outside these formal institutions. Across medieval Europe, there were women practicing advanced medicine, developing new surgical techniques, and conducting experiments that pushed the boundaries of contemporary knowledge. They couldn't publish their findings in academic journals because such things didn't exist yet. Instead, they passed their knowledge through apprenticeship networks and family traditions that preserved and transmitted scientific knowledge across generations. The economic innovations of medieval women are equally impressive and equally ignored. While textbooks focus on the rise of banking families like the Medici, they rarely mention the women who pioneered many of the financial instruments that made medieval commerce possible. Women were among the first to develop systems of credit and debt that allowed merchants to conduct business across vast distances. They created insurance mechanisms that protected against the risks of long-distance trade. They established the first international networks for currency exchange. Consider the wool trade that connected England, Flanders, and Italy in a complex web of international commerce. At every level of this trade, from the sheep farms of Yorkshire to the finishing workshops of Florence, women were playing crucial roles that went far beyond simple manual labour. They were the managers, the innovators, the risk-takers who made the whole system work. Yet when historians write about the rise of medieval capitalism, women's contributions are relegated to footnotes or ignored entirely. This systematic erasure of women's economic contributions has profound implications for how we understand medieval society. The traditional narrative portrays the medieval economy as a male-dominated system where women participated only as passive dependents. But the evidence tells a completely different story. Women were active entrepreneurs, innovative financiers, and strategic business leaders who helped create the economic foundations of modern Europe. The legal innovations of medieval women are perhaps even more remarkable. Excluded from formal legal training and barred from appearing as advocates in most courts, women developed alternative legal strategies that were often more effective than the official justice system. They mastered the art of informal arbitration, created their own systems of commercial law, and pioneered new approaches to property rights that challenged traditional feudal arrangements. Royal and noble women were particularly creative in their use of legal mechanisms to accumulate and protect power. They exploited loopholes in inheritance law, manipulated marriage contracts to their advantage, and used their roles as executors of estates to build vast networks of obligation and influence. Some became so skilled at legal maneuvering that they essentially functioned as informal lawyers for other women, helping them navigate the complex maze of medieval law. The military contributions of medieval women present another fascinating case study in hidden influence. While popular culture focuses on the rare examples of women who openly bore arms, like Joan of Arc, the reality is that women's military role was far more extensive and sophisticated than most people realize. They weren't just occasionally picking up swords in moments of crisis. They were integral to medieval military operations in ways that have been systematically overlooked. Castle defense was largely a female responsibility during the frequent absences of male lords. Women didn't just wait passively behind walls hoping for rescue. They organized defenses, managed supplies, coordinated intelligence networks, and made crucial strategic decisions that often determined the outcome of sieges. Some became so skilled at military logistics that they were sought after as advisors by male commanders who recognized their expertise. The intelligence networks that medieval women created were particularly sophisticated. As wives, daughters, and sisters of noble families, women had access to information that crossed political boundaries. They developed elaborate systems for gathering and transmitting intelligence that were far more effective than formal diplomatic channels. These networks provided early warning of military threats, facilitated secret negotiations, and sometimes prevented wars through behind-the-scenes diplomacy. But perhaps the most important military role that women played was in the realm of psychological warfare. Medieval conflict wasn't just about physical battles between armies. It was also about maintaining morale, managing public opinion, and creating narratives that justified political actions. Women excelled at these aspects of warfare, using their social networks to spread propaganda, their religious connections to claim divine sanction for their causes, and their cultural authority to shape how conflicts were understood by ordinary people. The artistic and cultural contributions of medieval women represent yet another dimension of their hidden influence. While we celebrate male artists, architects, and writers from the medieval period, we've largely forgotten the women who were creating equally impressive works and shaping cultural trends that influenced generations. This wasn't just because women were excluded from artistic guilds and workshops, though that was certainly part of the problem. It was also because the forms of artistic expression that women favored were later devalued by art historians who privileged certain types of creativity over others. Medieval women were pioneers in textile arts that combined aesthetic beauty with functional innovation. They developed new weaving techniques, created complex dye processes, and designed patterns that became status symbols across Europe. But because textiles were considered craft rather than fine art by later generations, these contributions were dismissed as mere domestic work rather than recognized as the sophisticated artistic achievements they actually were. The literary contributions of medieval women are finally beginning to receive the recognition they deserve, but for centuries, they were either attributed to male authors or simply ignored. Women were writing poetry, composing music, creating illuminated manuscripts, and developing new forms of narrative that influenced the development of European literature in profound ways. They pioneered the use of vernacular languages for serious literary work, created new genres of religious writing, and developed innovative approaches to storytelling that challenged conventional literary forms. What emerges from this deeper examination of medieval women's contributions is a picture of a society far more complex and dynamic than the simplified narrative we've inherited. Medieval Europe wasn't a static, patriarchal system where women had no agency or influence. It was a rapidly changing world where women were constantly finding new ways to participate in social, economic, political, and cultural life, despite the formal restrictions placed on them. The strength we're talking about wasn't just the ability to endure hardship, though medieval women certainly demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of extraordinary challenges. It was active strength, creative strength, the kind of strength that builds new institutions, develops innovative solutions to complex problems, and shapes the course of historical change, even when operating from positions of apparent powerlessness. This reframing of medieval women's history has profound implications for how we understand not just the Middle Ages, but the entire trajectory of European development. If we acknowledge the full extent of women's contributions during this crucial period, we have to revise our understanding of how medieval society actually functioned and how it evolved into the early modern world. The networks that medieval women created didn't disappear when the medieval period ended. They provided the foundation for many of the social and economic structures that would characterize the Renaissance and beyond. The legal innovations that women pioneered influenced the development of modern property law and commercial regulation. The educational institutions they founded evolved into some of Europe's most important centers of learning. But here's the most remarkable thing about this hidden history. The strategies that medieval women developed for accumulating and exercising power despite formal exclusion from official institutions became a template that women would use for centuries afterward. The patterns of networking, the techniques of indirect influence, the creation of parallel power structures, all of these approaches that we see in medieval women's lives would be refined and adapted by later generations of women fighting for recognition and rights in their own historical contexts. Understanding this historical continuity helps us grasp why the medieval period was so crucial for women's long-term development of political strategy. But to truly appreciate the sophistication of these medieval women, we need to examine specific case studies that reveal just how far their influence extended beyond what official records suggest. Let's start with the remarkable story of Matilda of Tuscany, an 11th century Italian noblewoman whose political maneuvering shaped the balance of power between the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic Church for decades. When most people think about the investiture controversy, they focus on the dramatic confrontation between Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII. But the real puppet master behind many of the political moves during this crisis was Matilda. Here's what makes her story so incredible. Matilda controlled vast territories across northern Italy that were strategically crucial for anyone wanting to control the Alpine passes between Germany and Rome. Both the emperor and the pope needed her support to achieve their goals. Instead of simply choosing sides like a good medieval vassal was supposed to, Matilda played both sides against each other for years, extracting maximum advantage from the conflict. But she wasn't just being opportunistic. Matilda had a sophisticated understanding of how political power actually worked in medieval Europe. She recognized that the future belonged to whoever could control the emerging urban centers and trade routes, not whoever controlled the most knights and castles. So while Henry and Gregory were fighting over ceremonial questions about who had the right to appoint bishops, Matilda was quietly building an economic empire based on commerce and manufacturing. Her military innovations were equally impressive. Traditional medieval warfare relied heavily on heavily armored cavalry charges, but Matilda pioneered the use of fortified urban centers as defensive strongholds. She turned entire cities into military bases that could withstand prolonged sieges, while serving as launching points for guerrilla attacks against enemy supply lines. These tactics would later influence the development of urban warfare throughout the later medieval period. What's most remarkable about Matilda's career is how she managed to maintain her independence while operating in a political system that theoretically gave her no legitimate authority. As a woman, she wasn't supposed to lead armies or negotiate treaties with emperors and popes, but she did both. And she did them so effectively that both the imperial and papal sides had to treat her as an equal partner in their negotiations. The key to her success was understanding that medieval political authority wasn't just based on formal legal rights. It was based on practical power, the ability to deliver results that other political actors needed. Matilda made herself indispensable by controlling resources and territory that both sides required for their survival. Once she had established that practical power base, the question of whether she had the legal right to exercise authority became irrelevant. This pattern of making themselves indispensable appears repeatedly in the careers of successful medieval women. They couldn't rely on inherited authority or formal position, so they had to create their own power bases through superior performance and strategic thinking. In many ways, this forced them to become more politically sophisticated than their male counterparts, who could often rely on traditional authority structures to maintain their position. Consider the case of Anna Komnenos, the Byzantine princess who became one of the most important historians of the medieval period. Her political career was destroyed when her attempt to overthrow her brother and seize the imperial throne failed in 1118. But instead of disappearing into obscurity like most failed medieval conspirators, Anna reinvented herself as a scholar and writer whose work would influence Byzantine culture for centuries. Anna's historical writings weren't just academic exercises. They were sophisticated pieces of political propaganda designed to rehabilitate her reputation and advance her family's interests long after her direct political influence had ended. She understood that controlling historical narrative could be more powerful than controlling armies, because historical narrative shaped how future generations understood political legitimacy and authority. Her masterwork, the Alexiad, ostensibly tells the story of her father's reign as Emperor Alexios I, but it's actually a subtle piece of feminist political theory disguised as a historical chronicle. Anna consistently portrays women as the real power behind the throne, the intelligent advisors whose counsel enables male rulers to achieve success. She presents herself and other Byzantine women as essential partners in imperial governance, not mere ornamental figures. But Anna went further than just advocating for women's political importance. She developed a sophisticated argument about why traditional masculine approaches to leadership were inadequate for the complex challenges facing the Byzantine Empire. Through carefully constructed examples and comparisons, she argued that successful governance required the kind of diplomatic subtlety, long-term planning, and network management that women had mastered out of necessity. This intellectual sophistication wasn't limited to royal women like Anna. Across medieval Europe, women were developing new forms of knowledge and new ways of thinking about complex problems that often surpassed the intellectual achievements of their male contemporaries. The key difference was that women's intellectual work was often embedded in practical contexts rather than abstract theoretical frameworks. Take the example of medieval medical practice. While male physicians trained at universities were learning to diagnose illnesses by consulting ancient Greek texts, women practitioners were developing empirical approaches based on direct observation and experimentation. They were pioneering surgical techniques, developing new pharmaceuticals from herbal sources, and creating diagnostic methods that were far more effective than the theoretical approaches favored by academic medicine. The midwives who managed childbirth throughout medieval Europe represent one of the most sophisticated medical communities of the period. They developed complex understanding of anatomy, pharmacology, and surgical intervention that was passed down through apprenticeship networks spanning multiple generations. These women were performing medical procedures that male physicians wouldn't attempt for centuries, yet their contributions have been almost completely erased from medical history. But medical knowledge was just one area where medieval women were pushing the boundaries of contemporary understanding. In agriculture, women were pioneering new cultivation techniques, developing improved plant varieties, and creating more efficient systems of crop rotation and soil management. In manufacturing, they were innovating production processes, developing new materials, and creating more sophisticated quality control systems. The brewing industry provides a perfect example of how women's technical innovations shaped medieval economic development. Throughout most of the medieval period, brewing was primarily a female occupation. Women developed the techniques for large-scale fermentation, created the distribution networks that brought beer to urban markets, and established the quality standards that made beer a safe alternative to contaminated water supplies. But as brewing became more profitable during the later medieval period, male-dominated guilds began pushing women out of the industry through legal restrictions and economic pressure. The technical knowledge that women had developed over centuries was appropriated by male brewers who then claimed credit for innovations they had simply inherited from female predecessors. This pattern of appropriation appears repeatedly throughout medieval economic history. Women would pioneer new industries or develop innovative techniques, but as those industries became more lucrative, men would use their superior legal and political power to exclude women and claim ownership of their innovations. The result is that many of the technological advances we associate with medieval progress were actually developed by women whose contributions have been systematically erased. The international trading networks that connected medieval Europe to Asia and Africa provide another fascinating example of women's hidden influence on historical development. While textbooks focus on famous male merchants like Marco Polo, they rarely mention the women who financed these expeditions, managed the complex logistics of long-distance trade, and developed the financial instruments that made international commerce possible. Jewish women were particularly important in medieval international trade because Jewish communities maintained connections across religious and political boundaries that Christian merchants couldn't easily access. These women developed sophisticated systems of credit and currency exchange that allowed merchants to conduct business from Spain to China without carrying dangerous amounts of precious contributions went far beyond simple financial services. Jewish women were among metals across thousands of miles of hostile territory, but they're the first medieval entrepreneurs to understand that successful international trade required detailed knowledge of foreign cultures, languages, and customs. They created educational networks that trained young merchants in the skills needed for cross-cultural business relationships. They established diplomatic connections that helped resolve commercial disputes across religious boundaries. The silk trade that connected medieval Europe to Central Asia and China depended heavily on female expertise at every stage of the process. From the cultivation of silkworms to the complex weaving techniques that created finished textiles, women controlled most of the technical knowledge required for silk production. But they also dominated the commercial networks that brought silk to European markets, creating some of the first truly global supply chains in human history. What makes these trading networks so remarkable is how they operated parallel to official diplomatic and military structures. While kings and emperors were fighting wars and negotiating treaties, Women merchants were building economic relationships that often proved more durable and influential than formal political alliances. These commercial connections provided alternative channels for communication and negotiation that sometimes prevented conflicts or facilitated peaceful resolutions to international disputes. The cultural exchange that occurred through these female-dominated trading networks had profound implications for medieval intellectual development. Women merchants didn't just trade goods, they also traded ideas, technologies, and artistic techniques. They were responsible for introducing European audiences to mathematical concepts from India, astronomical knowledge from the Islamic world, and artistic styles from Central Asia. But perhaps, most importantly, these international connections gave medieval women access to alternative models of female authority and achievement. European women who traveled to Constantinople or Cairo could observe societies where women exercised different kinds of power and influence. These experiences provided them with new ideas about what was possible for women and new strategies for achieving their goals within European society. The crusading period created unprecedented opportunities for this kind of international cultural exchange. While male crusaders were focused on military objectives, women who accompanied the crusading armies, or who remained behind to manage estates and territories, were building relationships that transcended the official purposes of the Crusades. They were learning about Islamic science and philosophy, Byzantine administrative techniques, and Middle Eastern commercial practices. Some of these women became cultural ambassadors who helped facilitate the transfer of knowledge between Islamic and Christian civilizations. They learned Arabic and other Middle Eastern languages, studied Islamic legal and philosophical texts, and developed personal relationships with Muslim women that provided insights into alternative approaches to social organization and governance. Eleanor of Aquitaine's participation in the Second Crusade provides a perfect example of how women use crusading opportunities to expand their political and cultural horizons. While her husband Louis VII was focused on military glory and religious merit, Eleanor was building relationships with Byzantine and Middle Eastern leaders that would influence her political strategies for decades afterward. Her time in Constantinople exposed her to Byzantine models of imperial authority, where women played more prominent roles in governance and diplomacy. Her experiences in the Middle East introduced her to Islamic concepts of law and administration that were more sophisticated than anything available in Western Europe. These international experiences transformed Eleanor from a provincial French queen into a cosmopolitan political operator whose influence would extend across multiple kingdoms and cultures. The knowledge and perspectives that Eleanor gained during the Second Crusade influenced her later career in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. Her approach to governing Aquitaine incorporated administrative techniques she had observed in Constantinople. Her diplomatic strategies reflected lessons she had learned from Middle Eastern political culture. Her patronage of literature and arts was influenced by the cultural sophistication she had encountered in Islamic civilization. This pattern of women using international connections to enhance their domestic political influence appears throughout the crusading period. Women who had traveled to the east or who had maintained correspondence with contacts in Constantinople and Cairo brought new ideas and techniques back to European society. They became agents of cultural and technological transfer who helped accelerate European development during the High Middle Ages, but the influence flowed in both directions. European women who settled in Crusader states or who married into Middle Eastern families introduced European approaches to governance, commerce, and social organization into Islamic and Byzantine societies. These cultural exchanges created hybrid forms of political and social organization that influenced development throughout the medieval Mediterranean world. The military orders that emerged during the crusading period provide another fascinating example of how medieval women created new institutional forms that served their interests while contributing to broader social development. While the famous military orders like the Knights Templar were exclusively male organizations, women created parallel institutions that played equally important roles in crusading society. The Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, commonly known as the Hospitallers, included a female branch that managed medical facilities throughout the Crusader states. These women developed some of the most advanced medical knowledge and surgical techniques of the medieval period. They created the first systematic approaches to military medicine, pioneering techniques for treating battle wounds and preventing disease in military camps. But their influence extended far beyond medical care. The female hospitallers became powerful landowners and political actors who shaped the development of Crusader society in fundamental ways. They controlled vast estates, managed complex agricultural and commercial enterprises, and maintained diplomatic relationships with both Christian and Muslim authorities. The sophistication of these female-run institutions reveals something crucial about medieval women's approach to power that we're only beginning to understand. While men often pursued authority through direct confrontation and formal hierarchy, women developed more subtle but ultimately more effective strategies based on service, expertise, and network building. The female hospitallers didn't just treat wounded soldiers. They became indispensable to the entire crusading enterprise by creating systems that nobody else could replicate. This approach to power through indispensability appears everywhere once you start looking for it. Medieval women understood instinctively that the most secure form of authority comes not from legal rights or inherited position, but from being so valuable that removing you would cause the entire system to collapse. They made themselves the irreplaceable experts, the essential connectors, the crucial problem solvers that everyone else depended on. Take the fascinating case of the medieval spice trade, one of the most lucrative and dangerous commercial enterprises of the period. While history books celebrate male explorers who risked their lives sailing to distant lands, they rarely mention the women who financed these expeditions, managed the complex logistics of international commerce, and developed the sophisticated knowledge of foreign markets that made the spice trade profitable. These women weren't just passive investors putting up money and hoping for returns. They were active managers who understood every aspect of the business, from cultivation techniques in distant lands to consumer preferences in European markets. They maintained correspondence with suppliers across Asia and Africa, tracked political developments that might affect trade routes, and developed contingency plans for dealing with the countless risks that threatened international commerce. But their expertise went far beyond simple business management. Medieval spice merchants needed to be part diplomat, part cultural anthropologist, part financial analyst, and part risk assessment specialist. They had to understand how monsoon patterns affected shipping schedules, how political instability in Central Asia might disrupt overland routes, and how religious festivals in different cultures could create opportunities for profitable trade. The women who mastered this complexity developed some of the most sophisticated analytical skills of the medieval period. They were processing information from dozens of different sources, making predictions about future market conditions, and coordinating activities across vast distances and multiple cultures. In many ways, they were the first truly global business strategists in human history. Their success required them to challenge fundamental assumptions about medieval social organization. The traditional feudal system was based on local relationships and face-to-face obligations, but international commerce required trust relationships that could span continents and cultural boundaries. Women spice merchants pioneered new forms of commercial law, developed innovative financial instruments, and created enforcement mechanisms that made long-distance trade possible. The letters and contracts that survive from medieval spice trading operations reveal an extraordinary level of commercial sophistication. These women were using complex hedging strategies to protect against currency fluctuations, developing insurance mechanisms to spread risk across multiple ventures, and creating partnership structures that allowed them to pool resources while maintaining individual control over their operations. But perhaps most impressively, they were building information networks that gave them competitive advantages over their rivals. A successful spice merchant needed to know about political developments in a dozen different kingdoms, weather patterns across multiple climate zones, and cultural trends that might affect demand for different products. The women who dominated this trade created intelligence-gathering systems that were more effective than most government diplomatic services. These commercial networks became conduits for much more than just trade goods. Ideas, technologies, artistic styles, and cultural practices flowed along the same routes that brought pepper and cinnamon to European markets. Women merchants became agents of cultural diffusion who helped spread innovations across vast geographical areas. The medical knowledge that European women gained through contact with Islamic and Asian practitioners revolutionized healthcare throughout medieval Europe. Surgical techniques, pharmaceutical knowledge, and diagnostic methods that had been developed in distant lands were adapted and improved by European women, who then disseminated this knowledge through their own professional networks. Similarly, artistic and architectural innovations traveled along commercial routes maintained by women merchants. European textile workers learned new dyeing techniques from Asian suppliers. European architects incorporated design elements they had encountered through commercial contacts in the Middle East. European musicians adapted instruments and musical styles that had originated in distant cultures. This cultural exchange process was far more sophisticated than the random diffusion that traditional historians describe. Women merchants were actively seeking out innovations that might give them competitive advantages, carefully evaluating new technologies and techniques, and making strategic decisions about which innovations to adopt and adapt for European markets. The educational implications of these commercial networks were equally profound. Medieval European women who participated in international trade often became some of the most learned and cosmopolitan individuals of their time. They learned multiple languages, studied foreign legal systems, and developed detailed knowledge of geography, astronomy, and natural philosophy that rivaled anything available in European universities. But they didn't keep this knowledge to themselves. Successful medieval businesswomen understood that their long-term success depended on developing the next generation of skilled practitioners. They created apprenticeship programs that trained young women in commercial techniques, established schools that taught practical skills needed for international trade, and funded translation projects that made foreign knowledge available to European audiences. The libraries that wealthy merchant women assembled in their homes often contained more diverse and current knowledge than the famous monastic libraries that historians traditionally celebrate. While monastery libraries focused primarily on religious texts and classical authors, merchant libraries contained practical manuals, commercial correspondence, technical treatises, and contemporary accounts of foreign lands and cultures. These private libraries became centers of learning that attracted scholars and intellectuals from across Europe. Women merchants who had accumulated substantial wealth often became patrons of learning who funded original research, supported promising scholars, and facilitated intellectual exchanges that advanced human knowledge in multiple fields. The architectural innovations that emerged from these merchant-sponsored intellectual centers influenced urban development throughout medieval Europe. Women who had observed advanced building techniques in Constantinople, Cairo, or Baghdad brought these ideas back to European cities where they were adapted to local conditions and preferences. The results were revolutionary. Medieval European cities began incorporating more sophisticated water management systems, more efficient heating and cooling methods, and more elegant architectural details that reflected international influences. The merchant houses that wealthy women built for themselves became showcases for architectural innovation that influenced urban design for centuries. But architectural innovation was just one aspect of the broader cultural transformation that medieval women merchants were driving. Their international connections gave them access to advanced knowledge in mathematics, engineering, astronomy, and natural philosophy that was far ahead of what was available in European academic institutions. They funded translation projects that brought Greek, Arabic, Persian, and Sanskrit texts into Latin and vernacular European languages. They supported scholars who were developing new mathematical techniques, improved astronomical instruments, and more accurate geographical knowledge. They sponsored experimental programs that tested new agricultural methods, manufacturing processes, and medical treatments. The scientific revolution that transformed European intellectual life during the later medieval period owed far more to the international networks maintained by women merchants than most historians have recognized. The knowledge that fueled European advances in mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and medicine often reached Europe through commercial channels controlled by women who understood the practical value of scientific innovation. These women weren't just passive transmitters of foreign knowledge. They were active participants in the research and development process who made original contributions to scientific understanding. Their practical experience with complex logistical problems gave them insights into mathematical and engineering challenges that purely theoretical approaches couldn't provide. The navigation techniques that made long-distance maritime commerce possible were developed through collaboration between women merchants who understood the practical requirements of ocean travel and male sailors who had hands-on experience with ships and sailing conditions. The result was a synthesis of theoretical knowledge and practical expertise that revolutionized medieval transportation. Similarly, the financial innovations that made international commerce profitable emerged from collaborations between women who understood market dynamics and male bankers who had expertise in monetary systems. These partnerships produced new approaches to credit, currency exchange, and risk management that laid the foundation for modern capitalism. The agricultural improvements that increased European food production during the High Middle Ages often originated in knowledge that women merchants brought back from their international travels. Improved crop varieties, more efficient cultivation techniques, and better livestock management practices were introduced to European farming through commercial networks controlled by women. But the most profound impact of medieval women's international activities may have been their influence on European social and political development. Their success in managing complex international enterprises demonstrated that women were capable of sophisticated leadership and strategic thinking that challenged traditional assumptions about gender roles and capabilities. The political theories that began emerging in European intellectual centers during the later medieval period increasingly acknowledged women's potential for effective governance and leadership. These theoretical developments weren't just abstract philosophical speculation. They were based on practical evidence that women could manage complex organizations, make strategic decisions under pressure, and achieve results that benefited entire communities. The legal innovations that expanded women's rights and opportunities during the later medieval period often originated in the practical needs of women merchants who required legal mechanisms to protect their business interests and enforce their contracts. The commercial law that emerged to support international trade included provisions that gave women unprecedented legal authority and economic independence. These legal changes had implications that extended far beyond commercial activity. As women gained legal rights in business contexts, they began using these rights to expand their influence in other areas of social and political life. The legal precedents established for women merchants became the foundation for broader campaigns for women's rights and opportunities. The educational institutions that women merchants established to train the next generation of business practitioners evolved into some of Europe's most important centers of learning. The practical curriculum that these schools developed influenced the development of European education in ways that are still visible today. But perhaps most importantly, the success of medieval women merchants provided later generations with powerful examples of what women could achieve when given opportunities to develop and use their talents. The careers of these remarkable women became inspiration and guidance for subsequent generations of women who faced their own challenges in pursuing education, careers, and political influence. The networks that medieval women created didn't disappear when the medieval period ended. They provided the foundation for many of the social and economic structures that would characterize the Renaissance and the early modern period. The commercial relationships, intellectual connections, and cultural exchanges that medieval women had built continued to influence European development for centuries. The Renaissance celebration of human potential and achievement drew heavily on examples from medieval women's lives, even though these examples were often not explicitly acknowledged. The humanist emphasis on education, individual achievement, and cultural sophistication reflected values and practices that medieval women had been developing and promoting for centuries. The exploration and colonization projects that characterized the early modern period, built on geographical knowledge, navigation techniques, and international relationships that medieval women merchants had established. The financial instruments and commercial practices that made these projects possible were refinements of innovations that medieval women had pioneered. But the most lasting legacy of medieval women's achievements may be the demonstration that social and cultural progress doesn't require formal authority or official recognition. Medieval women proved that determined individuals working through informal networks and alternative institutions could drive historical change even when excluded from traditional power structures. This lesson has profound implications for understanding how social change actually occurs and how marginalized groups can achieve influence and recognition despite systematic discrimination and exclusion. The strategies that medieval women developed for accumulating power, building influence, and creating lasting change provide a template that has been used by reform movements throughout subsequent history. The environmental knowledge that medieval women developed through their agricultural and commercial activities also had lasting impact on European development. Their understanding of sustainable farming practices, efficient resource management, and ecological balance influenced land use patterns that persisted for centuries. Women who managed large estates during the frequent absences of their husbands developed some of the most sophisticated approaches to environmental stewardship in medieval Europe. They understood that long-term productivity required careful attention to soil conservation, forest management, and water resource protection. These women pioneered crop rotation systems that maintained soil fertility while maximizing agricultural output. They developed integrated farming approaches that combined animal husbandry, crop production, and forest management in ways that created sustainable rural economies. They established conservation practices that protected wildlife populations while still allowing for hunting and fishing that supplemented rural diets. The forestry techniques that medieval women developed were particularly innovative. They understood that forests were complex ecosystems that provided multiple benefits, including timber, fuel, food, and wildlife habitat. Their management approaches balanced these different uses in ways that maintained forest health while meeting human needs. The hunting practices that medieval women developed reveal another dimension of their sophisticated environmental understanding. While popular culture portrays medieval hunting as a masculine aristocratic pastime focused on display and entertainment, the reality was far more complex. Women who managed estates needed to balance wildlife conservation with practical needs for meat, leather, and population control of animals that could damage crops. These women developed sustainable hunting protocols that maintained healthy animal populations while providing necessary resources for their communities. They understood breeding cycles, migration patterns, and ecological relationships in ways that allowed them to harvest wildlife without depleting populations. Their approaches to game management were often more scientifically sophisticated than the wasteful hunting practices that male nobles engaged in for sport. But medieval women's environmental innovations extended far beyond agriculture and forestry. Those who lived in coastal regions developed advanced understanding of marine ecosystems that allowed them to manage fishing operations sustainably while building profitable businesses. They understood seasonal fish migrations, breeding cycles, and the complex relationships between different marine species. The fishing operations that women managed often employed techniques that maximize catch while minimizing environmental damage. They developed selective harvesting methods that protected breeding populations, established seasonal restrictions that allowed fish stocks to recover, and created processing and preservation techniques that reduced waste while extending the useful life of their catch. Women who controlled salt production facilities along European coastlines became some of the most environmentally sophisticated managers of the medieval period. Salt extraction required careful balance between maximizing production and protecting the coastal ecosystems that made production possible. These women developed techniques that maintained the health of salt marshes while creating profitable businesses that supplied one of medieval Europe's most essential commodities. The knowledge that these coastal women developed about tides, weather patterns, and marine ecology made them invaluable advisors to merchants and mariners who depended on ocean transportation. Their understanding of seasonal variations in coastal conditions often determined the success or failure of commercial ventures that relied on maritime shipping. Medieval women's innovations in urban environmental management are equally impressive, but even less recognized. As cities grew larger and more crowded during the High Middle Ages, women took leading roles in developing sanitation systems, waste management protocols, and public health measures that made urban life viable for growing populations. The textile workshops that women operated in medieval cities faced complex environmental challenges that required innovative solutions. Dyeing processes used chemicals that could contaminate water supplies if not managed properly. Wool processing created organic waste that could cause disease if allowed to accumulate. Weaving operations generated dust and fiber particles that could affect air quality in crowded workshops. Women who managed these operations developed some of the first systematic approaches to industrial environmental management. They created waste treatment systems that neutralized harmful chemicals before releasing them into water supplies. They established ventilation systems that protected workers from airborne contaminants. They developed recycling processes that turned waste materials into useful products. The public health innovations that medieval women pioneered in urban settings had profound implications for European demographic development. Their sanitation systems helped prevent the spread of epidemic diseases that could devastate entire cities. Their food safety protocols reduced deaths from contaminated food and water. Their waste management systems prevented the accumulation of organic matter that could breed disease-carrying insects and rodents. But perhaps most importantly, these women understood that urban environmental problems required collective solutions that went beyond individual household management. They organized neighborhood groups that coordinated sanitation efforts, established community standards for waste disposal, and created enforcement mechanisms that ensured compliance with public health measures. The legal frameworks that emerged to support these collective environmental management efforts represented some of the earliest forms of municipal governance in medieval Europe. Women who had organized successful community sanitation programs often became informal civic leaders who influenced broader urban policy development. These civic leadership roles gave medieval women unprecedented opportunities to shape the development of European cities in ways that extended far beyond environmental management. They became advocates for improved infrastructure, better housing standards, and more effective municipal services. Their practical experience managing complex community problems made them valuable advisors to formal government officials who often lacked hands-on administrative experience. The market systems that medieval women developed to support urban food distribution represent another area of remarkable innovation that has been largely overlooked by historians. Feeding growing urban populations required sophisticated logistics that coordinated agricultural production in surrounding rural areas with consumer demand in city centres. Women who managed these food distribution systems needed to understand seasonal variations in agricultural production, transportation limitations that affected the movement of perishable goods, and consumer preferences that varied with economic conditions and cultural traditions. They developed supply chain management techniques that ensured adequate food supplies while minimizing waste and spoilage. The preservation techniques that these women pioneered allowed urban populations to maintain varied diets even during seasons when fresh produce was unavailable. They developed smoking, salting, and fermentation methods that extended the storage life of meat, fish, and dairy products. They created drying and pickling techniques that preserved fruits and vegetables through winter months. But their innovations went beyond simple food preservation. These women understood that urban populations needed balanced nutrition to maintain health and productivity. They developed food combinations that provided essential nutrients even when individual ingredients were limited or expensive. They created preparation methods that maximized the nutritional value of available ingredients. The cooking techniques that urban women developed during the medieval period influenced European cuisine in ways that persist to the present day. Their approaches to combining ingredients, managing cooking temperatures, and timing complex meal preparation established culinary traditions that became fundamental to European food culture. The restaurant and hospitality industries that began emerging in medieval cities owed their development largely to innovations that women had pioneered in domestic food management. The techniques for preparing food in large quantities, managing diverse dietary requirements, and creating pleasant dining environments all originated in households where women had been feeding large extended families and frequent guests. Medieval women's contributions to the development of European music and performing arts represent another area where their influence has been systematically underestimated. While histories of medieval music focus primarily on male composers and church-based musical traditions, women were creating equally sophisticated musical works and developing performance traditions that influenced European musical development for centuries. The secular musical traditions that flourished in medieval courts often originated in women's domestic cultural activities. The songs that women sang while working, the dances they performed at family celebrations, and the instrumental music they created for their own entertainment provided the foundation for much of what we now consider medieval secular music. Women who served as cultural organizers in noble households were responsible for coordinating musical performances, training young musicians, and commissioning new musical works. They developed performance standards, established repertoires of popular songs and instrumental pieces, and created the social context that made musical performance an integral part of medieval court culture. The musical instruments that became central to medieval European music were often refined and perfected through the practical experience of women performers. The techniques for playing stringed instruments, wind instruments, and percussion instruments were developed and transmitted through informal networks of women musicians who shared knowledge and techniques across regional boundaries. But women's contributions to medieval music extended beyond performance and instrument development. They were active composers who created original musical works that influenced the development of European musical traditions. Their compositions often explored themes and employed techniques that were different from the religious music that dominated formal musical education. The preservation of medieval musical traditions owed much to the efforts of women who maintained family and community musical practices, even when formal musical institutions were disrupted by warfare or political upheaval. They served as cultural repositories who kept musical knowledge alive through periods of social instability. The dance traditions that became central to medieval European culture were largely developed and maintained by women who understood dance as both artistic expression and social communication. The complex choreographies that characterized medieval court dances required sophisticated understanding of rhythm, spatial relationships, and group coordination. Women who organized social events in medieval communities developed some of the earliest systematic approaches to event management and cultural programming. They coordinated musical performances, arranged dance exhibitions, and created entertainment programs that brought communities together for celebration and cultural exchange. These cultural organizing skills translated into broader leadership capabilities that women used in other contexts. The ability to coordinate complex group activities, manage diverse personalities, and create enjoyable experiences for large numbers of people proved valuable in commercial, political, and social reform contexts. The storytelling traditions that preserved medieval European cultural knowledge were predominantly maintained by women who understood narrative as both entertainment and education. The folk tales, historical chronicles, and moral instruction stories that shaped medieval European cultural consciousness were largely created and transmitted by women. These women weren't just passive preservers of existing stories. They were active creators who adapted traditional narratives to address contemporary concerns, developed new stories that reflected changing social conditions, and employed storytelling techniques that made complex ideas accessible to diverse audiences. The educational value of women's storytelling activities extended far beyond simple entertainment. Through carefully crafted narratives, they transmitted practical knowledge about everything from agricultural techniques to medical treatments. They preserved historical knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. They provided moral and ethical instruction that helped shape community values and individual behavior. The literary innovations that women developed through their storytelling activities influenced the development of European literature in profound ways. Their techniques for character development, plot construction, and thematic exploration provided models that later written literature would adapt and refine. But perhaps most importantly, women's storytelling traditions created alternative cultural narratives that challenged dominant social assumptions and provided different perspectives on historical events and social relationships. These alternative narratives gave voice to experiences and viewpoints that were excluded from official historical accounts and religious teachings. The preservation of these alternative cultural traditions became increasingly important as medieval European society became more centralized and institutionalized. Women's storytelling networks provided spaces where different ways of understanding the world could be maintained and transmitted, even when they contradicted official cultural doctrines. The therapeutic aspects of medieval women's cultural activities represent another dimension of their social contributions that has been largely overlooked. Women understood that music, dance, storytelling, and other cultural activities had healing properties that could address both physical and emotional ailments. The healing songs that women used to treat various medical conditions represented sophisticated understanding of how sound and rhythm could affect human physiology and psychology. These women developed musical prescriptions for specific ailments, created therapeutic performance techniques, and established cultural healing practices that complemented other medical treatments. The dance therapies that women employed for treating physical disabilities and emotional disorders demonstrated advanced understanding of how movement and physical expression could promote healing and recovery. They developed exercise programs disguised as dance activities, created movement therapies that addressed specific medical conditions, and established recreational activities that promoted both physical and mental health. The community healing practices that women organized around cultural activities helped address the social and psychological trauma that resulted from warfare, disease, and other medieval calamities. They created group activities that helped communities process collective trauma, established mourning rituals that facilitated grief recovery, and developed celebration practices that restored community morale and cohesion. These therapeutic cultural practices became particularly important during the periodic crises that disrupted medieval European society. When communities were devastated by plague, warfare, or natural disasters, women's cultural healing activities often provided the foundation for community recovery and reconstruction. The psychological sophistication that medieval women demonstrated in their cultural healing practices reflected deep understanding of human nature and social dynamics that rivaled anything available in formal academic psychology. Their practical experience managing complex family and community relationships had given them insights into human behavior that they applied therapeutically through cultural activities. The educational innovations that women developed through their cultural activities had lasting impact on European intellectual development. Their approaches to using entertainment and artistic expression as vehicles for learning influenced the development of European educational philosophy and practice. The integration of artistic activities with practical education that women pioneered in their domestic teaching created models for holistic education that recognized the connections between intellectual, emotional, and physical development. These educational approaches influenced the development of European schools and universities in ways that are still visible today. But the most profound legacy of medieval women's cultural contributions may be their demonstration that culture itself could be a form of power and influence that operated independently of formal political and economic structures. Through their cultural activities, women created alternative sources of authority and respect that allowed them to exercise leadership even when excluded from official positions. This understanding of culture as a form of soft power provided medieval women with strategies for influence that complemented their more direct political and economic activities. Their cultural leadership enhanced their credibility in other contexts and provided them with networks of supporters who respected their artistic and intellectual capabilities. The Renaissance celebration of artistic achievement and cultural sophistication drew heavily on foundations that medieval women had established through centuries of cultural innovation and leadership. The humanist emphasis on individual creative expression reflected values that medieval women had been promoting through their cultural activities. The artistic patronage systems that characterized Renaissance culture evolved directly from the support networks that medieval women had created for musicians, storytellers, and other cultural practitioners. The techniques for identifying and nurturing artistic talent that became central to Renaissance cultural development originated in medieval women's domestic cultural activities. But perhaps most importantly, the medieval women's demonstration that cultural leadership could provide pathways to broader social influence became a template that later generations of women would adapt and refine as they sought recognition and authority in their own historical contexts. The international cultural exchange networks that medieval women had established continued to facilitate the spread of artistic and intellectual innovations throughout the early modern period. The relationships between European and Middle Eastern cultural traditions that had been developed through medieval women's commercial and diplomatic activities provided foundations for Renaissance cultural synthesis. The educational institutions that Renaissance humanists established, built on pedagogical innovations that medieval women had pioneered in their domestic teaching activities. The integration of practical and theoretical learning that characterized humanist education reflected approaches that medieval women had developed out of necessity when formal educational institutions were unavailable to them. The scientific revolution that transformed European intellectual life during the early modern period drew on empirical approaches and practical knowledge that medieval women had been developing through their various professional and domestic activities. Their emphasis on observation, experimentation, and practical application provided methodological foundations that formal scientific institutions would later adopt and systematize. The agricultural innovations that medieval women developed had implications that extended far beyond food production. Their understanding of seasonal cycles, soil management, and crop rotation created sustainable farming systems that supported population growth while maintaining environmental balance. But more importantly, their agricultural expertise gave them economic independence that translated into political influence in ways that have been completely overlooked by traditional historians. Consider the case of medieval estate management during the frequent military campaigns that characterized the High Middle Ages. When lords departed for extended periods of warfare, their wives weren't just keeping the home fires burning. They were making critical decisions about crop selection, land use, and resource allocation that determined the economic viability of entire regions. These women were essentially functioning as agricultural CEOs, managing complex operations that involved hundreds of workers and thousands of acres of productive land. The sophistication of their decision-making process was remarkable. They had to balance immediate survival needs against long-term sustainability goals. They needed to understand market conditions that might affect the profitability of different crops. They had to manage labor relations during periods when many able-bodied men were away fighting. And they had to do all of this while maintaining the political relationships that protected their territories from hostile neighbors. What emerges from surviving estate records is a picture of women who were far more economically sophisticated than their male counterparts. While men focused primarily on short-term military objectives, women developed long-term strategies that ensured economic stability across multiple generations. Their approach to resource management reflected understanding of complex systems thinking that wouldn't become formal academic theory for centuries. The water management systems that medieval women designed for their estates represent some of the most advanced engineering of the period. They understood that sustainable agriculture required careful control of water resources, so they designed irrigation systems, constructed drainage networks, and built storage facilities that maximized agricultural productivity while preventing environmental degradation. These hydraulic engineering projects required sophisticated understanding of topography, geology, and hydrology that rivaled anything available in formal engineering education. The women who designed these systems were essentially self-taught engineers who learned through practical experimentation and careful observation of natural processes. But their engineering innovations extended beyond agriculture. Medieval women designed and constructed mills for grain processing, workshops for textile production, and storage facilities for preserving agricultural surplus. These industrial facilities required understanding of mechanics, materials science, and structural engineering that demonstrated remarkable technical competence. The organizational systems that women developed for managing these complex agricultural and industrial operations influenced the development of medieval economic institutions in profound ways. Their approaches to labor management, quality control, and production scheduling provided models that were later adopted by male-dominated guilds and commercial enterprises. The accounting systems that women created to track agricultural production, monitor expenses, and calculate profits were among the most sophisticated financial management tools of the medieval period. These women were pioneers in cost accounting, inventory management, and financial planning who developed techniques that laid the groundwork for modern business administration. Their record-keeping systems preserve detailed information about medieval economic life that provides historians with invaluable insights into how medieval society actually functioned. The estate records that surviving women's archives contain offer more comprehensive and accurate pictures of medieval economic activity than the official documents that male administrators produced. But perhaps most remarkably, these women understood that economic success required continuous innovation and adaptation to changing conditions. They were constantly experimenting with new crops, testing improved cultivation techniques, and developing more efficient processing methods. Their approach to agricultural management was fundamentally entrepreneurial in ways that challenged traditional assumptions about medieval economic conservatism. The marketing strategies that medieval women developed for selling their agricultural surplus demonstrate sophisticated understanding of consumer behavior and market dynamics. They understood that different products appealed to different social classes, that seasonal variations affected demand patterns, and that quality differentiation could command premium prices. These women were among the first medieval entrepreneurs to understand branding and product positioning as marketing strategies. They developed reputations for producing superior quality goods that commanded higher prices than generic commodities. They created distribution networks that reached customers across regional boundaries. They established customer relationships that generated repeat business and referral sales. The commercial success of women-managed agricultural operations had significant implications for medieval social structure. As these women accumulated wealth through their business activities, they gained economic independence that allowed them to exercise political influence without relying on male support or approval. Their economic success also provided them with resources to invest in other ventures that further expanded their influence and authority. Successful agricultural entrepreneurs often became patrons of religious institutions, sponsors of educational projects, and supporters of artistic endeavors that enhanced their social status and cultural influence. The philanthropic activities that wealthy medieval women undertook represent another dimension of their social impact that has been systematically underestimated. These women understood that their long-term security and influence depended on maintaining good relationships with their communities, so they invested substantial resources in projects that benefited broader society. The hospitals that medieval women founded and funded provided medical care for populations that had no other access to professional healthcare. These institutions weren't just charitable operations. They were sophisticated medical facilities that employed advanced treatment methods and conducted original research that advanced medical knowledge. The schools that women established to provide education for children from poor families created opportunities for social mobility that challenged traditional class hierarchies. These educational institutions often provided better instruction than the formal schools available to wealthy families because they focused on practical skills that prepared students for productive careers. The infrastructure projects that women sponsored improved transportation, communication, and commerce throughout medieval Europe. They funded road construction, bridge building, and harbour improvements that facilitated economic development and cultural exchange. They established markets and trading centres that became focal points for regional economic activity. But their philanthropic activities went beyond simple charity work. These women understood that strategic investment in community development could create conditions that enhanced their own economic opportunities while benefiting society as a whole. Their approach to philanthropy reflected sophisticated understanding of how individual success and community welfare could be mutually reinforcing. The religious institutions that medieval women founded often became centers of innovation that influenced European intellectual and cultural development. The convents that wealthy women established weren't just places of prayer and contemplation. They were educational centers, research facilities, and cultural institutions that preserved knowledge and fostered new ideas. The scriptoriums that women operated in these religious institutions played crucial roles in preserving and transmitting classical knowledge during periods when formal educational institutions were disrupted by warfare and political instability. The manuscripts that these women copied and illustrated provided the textual foundation for later intellectual revivals. But these women weren't just passive preservers of existing knowledge. They were active scholars who produced original works that contributed to medieval intellectual development. Their writings on theology, philosophy, natural science, and practical arts demonstrated intellectual capabilities that rivaled anything produced by male scholars in formal academic institutions. The artistic patronage that wealthy medieval women provided supported cultural developments that enriched European civilization in lasting ways. They commissioned architectural projects, sponsored musical compositions, and funded artistic works that became treasures of European cultural heritage. Their architectural projects often incorporated innovative design elements that influenced the development of European architectural styles. The churches, palaces, and civic buildings that women commissioned demonstrated aesthetic sophistication and technical competence that challenged traditional assumptions about women's artistic capabilities. The musical traditions that women supported through their patronage activities preserved and developed cultural knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Their support for musicians, composers, and instrument makers created cultural environments that fostered artistic innovation and excellence. But perhaps most importantly, their artistic patronage provided alternative cultural narratives that challenged dominant social assumptions and provided different perspectives on human experience. The works that women commissioned often explored themes and employed aesthetic approaches that differed from the male-dominated cultural mainstream. The educational impact of women's artistic patronage extended far beyond simple aesthetic appreciation. Through carefully selected artistic projects, these women transmitted cultural values, historical knowledge, and social commentary that influenced public understanding of contemporary issues and historical developments. The diplomatic activities that medieval women conducted through their various social and economic networks represent another area where their influence has been systematically underestimated. While formal diplomacy was supposedly a male prerogative, women were conducting informal diplomatic activities that often proved more effective than official negotiations. The marriage alliances that women arranged for their children and relatives were essentially diplomatic treaties disguised as family celebrations. These women understood that strategic marriages could prevent wars, resolve territorial disputes, and create economic partnerships that benefited entire regions. Their correspondence networks provided unofficial communication channels that allowed political information to flow across boundaries, even when formal diplomatic relationships were disrupted by conflict. These women often served as intermediaries who facilitated negotiations between hostile parties who couldn't communicate directly. The cultural exchanges that women organized through their international connections promoted understanding between different societies and reduced the likelihood of conflicts based on ignorance or misunderstanding. Their activities as cultural ambassadors complemented and sometimes superseded the work of official diplomatic representatives. The intelligence gathering that women conducted through their social networks provided political leaders with information that was more current and accurate than what official intelligence services could provide. Their ability to access information through informal channels gave them strategic advantages that they used to influence political developments. But their diplomatic activities went beyond simple information gathering and message transmission. These women were active participants in peacemaking processes who developed innovative approaches to conflict resolution that emphasized long-term relationship building over short-term tactical victories. The legal innovations that medieval women pioneered through their various activities had lasting impact on European legal development. Their practical experience managing complex business operations, property relationships, and family affairs gave them insights into legal problems that formal legal education didn't address. The contract forms that women developed for their business activities established precedents that influenced the development of commercial law throughout Europe. Their approaches to partnership agreements, employment contracts, and property transfers created legal mechanisms that supported economic development and social mobility. The dispute resolution methods that women developed for managing conflicts within their communities provided alternatives to formal court systems that were often more effective and less costly than official legal procedures. Their emphasis on mediation, arbitration, and negotiated settlements influenced the development of alternative dispute resolution systems. The property law innovations that women achieved through strategic use of existing legal mechanisms expanded women's legal rights and economic opportunities in ways that had implications far beyond individual cases. Their success in manipulating inheritance law, marriage law, and property law created precedents that other women could use to advance their own interests. But perhaps most importantly, the legal strategies that medieval women developed demonstrated that determined individuals could achieve significant legal reforms even when excluded from formal legal institutions. Their success in expanding their legal rights and opportunities provided models that later reform movements would adapt and refine. The technological innovations that medieval women developed through their various practical activities contributed to European technological development in ways that have been almost completely overlooked by historians of science and technology. Their hands-on experience with complex practical problems led them to develop solutions that often surpassed anything available through formal technical education. The manufacturing techniques that women pioneered in textile production influenced the development of European industrial technology for centuries. Their innovations in spinning, weaving, dyeing, and finishing created production methods that remained state-of-the-art until the Industrial Revolution introduced mechanized alternatives. The food processing technologies that women developed for preserving and preparing food established techniques that supported population growth and urbanization throughout the medieval period. Their methods for preservation, fermentation, and preparation created food systems that could support large populations even during periods of agricultural disruption. The medical technologies that women developed through their healing practices advanced European medical knowledge in ways that formal medical education couldn't match. Their empirical approaches to diagnosis and treatment produced medical innovations that were centuries ahead of theoretical medical knowledge. The construction technologies that women employed in their various building projects demonstrated engineering capabilities that rivaled anything available through formal engineering education. Their approaches to structural design, materials selection, and project management established techniques that influenced European construction practices for generations. But their technological contributions extended beyond simple practical innovations. These women understood that technological development required systematic approaches to research, experimentation, and knowledge transmission that went beyond individual creativity and insight. The research methods that women developed for investigating practical problems established empirical approaches that laid groundwork for later scientific methodology. Their emphasis on observation, experimentation, and systematic record-keeping created investigative techniques that formal scientific institutions would later adopt and systematize. The knowledge transmission systems that women created for sharing technical innovations ensured that useful discoveries were preserved and disseminated rather than lost when individual practitioners died. Their apprenticeship programs, technical manuals, and professional networks created mechanisms for technological diffusion that accelerated European technological development. The quality control systems that women developed for their various production activities established standards and procedures that influenced European manufacturing for centuries. Their approaches to product specification, process monitoring, and performance evaluation created quality management techniques that supported the development of European commercial reputation and competitive advantage. The environmental management techniques that women developed through their various activities demonstrated sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships and sustainable resource use that was centuries ahead of formal environmental science. Their practical experience managing complex natural systems gave them insights into environmental problems that theoretical approaches couldn't provide. The conservation practices that women established for protecting natural resources ensured that European societies could maintain economic productivity while preserving environmental quality. Their approaches to forest management, soil conservation, and wildlife protection created sustainable resource use patterns that supported long-term economic development. The restoration techniques that women developed for repairing environmental damage demonstrated understanding of ecological recovery processes that formal environmental science wouldn't achieve for centuries. Their success in rehabilitating damaged ecosystems provided models for environmental restoration that remain relevant today. But perhaps most importantly, the environmental philosophy that medieval women developed through their practical experience emphasized the interconnectedness of human society and natural systems in ways that challenged traditional assumptions about human-environment relationships. The social innovations that medieval women created through their various activities established new forms of social organization that influenced European social development in lasting ways. Their success in creating alternative institutional forms demonstrated that determined individuals could develop new approaches to social problems, even when excluded from existing institutional structures. The community organizations that women established for addressing various social problems created models for voluntary association and collective action that influenced the development of European civil society. Their approaches to group organization, leadership development, and resource mobilization established techniques for social reform that remain relevant today. The educational innovations that women pioneered through their various teaching activities created new approaches to human development that recognized the complex relationships between intellectual, emotional, and practical learning. Their holistic educational philosophy influenced European educational development in ways that are still visible today. The economic institutions that women created for supporting their various business activities established new forms of commercial organization that supported entrepreneurship and innovation. Their approaches to partnership formation risk-sharing, and profit distribution created business models that influenced European commercial development. The political strategies that women developed for exercising influence, despite formal exclusion from political institutions, created new approaches to power and authority that challenged traditional assumptions about political legitimacy and effectiveness. Their success in achieving political influence through alternative channels demonstrated that formal institutional power was not the only path to political effectiveness. But the most profound social innovation that medieval women achieved may have been their demonstration that individual agency and collective action could create meaningful social change, even under conditions of systematic discrimination and exclusion. Their success in expanding their opportunities and influence provided inspiration and guidance for subsequent generations of reformers who faced their own challenges in pursuing social justice and human development. The cultural legacy that medieval women created through their various activities provided European civilization with intellectual and artistic resources that enriched human experience in lasting ways. Their contributions to literature, music, visual arts, and philosophy establish cultural traditions that continue to influence European cultural development today. The intellectual traditions that women established through their scholarly activities created alternative approaches to knowledge and understanding that complemented and sometimes challenged the male-dominated academic mainstream. Their emphasis on practical knowledge, empirical investigation, and holistic thinking influenced European intellectual development in ways that formal educational institutions were slow to recognize. The artistic traditions that women created through their cultural activities established aesthetic approaches and expressive techniques that enriched European artistic development. Their innovations in various artistic media provided models and inspiration for later generations of artists who built on their creative achievements. The philosophical traditions that women developed through their reflective activities on the challenges and opportunities of medieval life created new approaches to understanding human experience and social organization. Their insights into the relationships between individual development and social welfare influenced European philosophical development in ways that are only beginning to be recognized. But perhaps most importantly, the cultural synthesis that medieval women achieved through their various activities demonstrated that human creativity and insight could flourish even under conditions of systematic constraint and limitation. Their success in creating meaningful cultural works despite restricted opportunities provided evidence of human potential that continues to inspire creative individuals facing their own challenges and limitations. The international impact of medieval women's achievements extended far beyond European boundaries and influenced global historical development in ways that traditional historical narratives have completely overlooked. Their commercial networks, diplomatic relationships, and cultural exchanges created connections between European and non-European civilizations that facilitated the exchange of knowledge, technology, and cultural innovations across vast geographical distances. The trading relationships that European women established with merchants and producers in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East created economic connections that supported technological and cultural diffusion between civilizations. Their commercial activities provided channels for the transmission of mathematical knowledge, scientific techniques, and artistic innovations that enriched all participating cultures. The diplomatic relationships that European women maintained with political and cultural leaders in other civilizations created unofficial channels for international communication and negotiation that complemented and sometimes superseded formal diplomatic activities. Their cultural diplomacy helped prevent conflicts and facilitated peaceful resolution of international disputes. The educational relationships that European women established with scholars and teachers in other civilizations created opportunities for intellectual exchange that advanced human knowledge across cultural boundaries. Their participation in international scholarly networks helped preserve and transmit knowledge during periods when formal educational institutions were disrupted by warfare and political instability. But their international influence went beyond simple cultural exchange and diplomatic facilitation. European medieval women were active participants in global historical processes who helped shape the development of international relationships and cross-cultural understanding in ways that had lasting impact on world historical development. The technological innovations that resulted from their international connections advanced human knowledge and capability in ways that benefited all participating civilizations. The agricultural techniques, manufacturing processes, and medical knowledge that they helped transmit across cultural boundaries improved living conditions and economic opportunities for populations across multiple continents. The cultural synthesis that they achieved through their international activities created new forms of artistic expression and intellectual understanding that enriched human cultural heritage. Their success in combining elements from different cultural traditions demonstrated the creative potential of cross-cultural exchange and collaboration. The social innovations that they developed through their international experiences provided models for organizing human relationships and social institutions that transcended cultural boundaries. Their approaches to conflict resolution, community organization, and educational development influenced social development across multiple civilizations. But perhaps most importantly, their international activities demonstrated that determined individuals could create meaningful connections across cultural, religious, and political boundaries, even during historical periods characterized by conflict and mistrust. Their success in building bridges between civilizations provided evidence of human potential for cooperation and mutual understanding that remains relevant today. The methodological innovations that modern historians are developing to recover and understand medieval women's contributions represent a fundamental shift in how historical research is conducted and how historical knowledge is constructed. The traditional approaches that focus primarily on formal institutional records and male-dominated political narratives are being supplemented by new research methods that can identify and interpret evidence of women's activities and influence. The archaeological evidence that is being uncovered through systematic investigation of medieval sites is revealing material evidence of women's economic activities, technological innovations, and cultural contributions that written records either ignored or systematically underreported. The physical remains of women's workshops, laboratories, and living spaces provide concrete evidence of their capabilities and achievements. The linguistic analysis that is being applied to medieval texts is revealing subtle evidence of women's intellectual contributions and cultural influence that previous generations of historians missed or misinterpreted. The careful examination of word choice, rhetorical strategies, and cultural references is uncovering women's voices in texts that were previously assumed to represent exclusively male perspectives. The economic analysis that is being applied to surviving financial records is revealing the extent of women's commercial activities and economic influence in ways that challenge traditional assumptions about medieval economic organization. The systematic examination of account books, contracts, and commercial correspondence is documenting women's roles in international trade, industrial production, and financial innovation. The social network analysis that is being used to map relationships between medieval individuals and institutions is revealing the extent of women's informal political influence and cultural authority. The systematic examination of correspondence, family relationships, and institutional connections is documenting how women exercise power and influence through alternative channels that operated parallel to formal political structures. But perhaps most importantly, the interdisciplinary approaches that are being developed to study medieval women's lives are creating new models for historical research that recognizes the complex interactions between individual agency and structural constraints in shaping historical development. These new methodological approaches are providing more complete and accurate understandings of how historical change actually occurs and how different groups of people contribute to social development. The implications of this historical recovery project extend far beyond academic historical knowledge. understanding the full extent of medieval women's contributions to European development provides contemporary society with new perspectives on human potential and social organization that remain relevant for addressing current challenges and opportunities. The entrepreneurial strategies that medieval women developed for creating economic opportunities despite systematic exclusion from formal business institutions provide models that remain relevant for contemporary entrepreneurs facing discrimination and limited access to resources. Their success in building successful enterprises through innovation, network building, and strategic thinking demonstrates approaches that continue to be effective. The educational innovations that medieval women pioneered for providing learning opportunities outside formal institutional structures provide models that remain relevant for contemporary educational reformers seeking to expand access to knowledge and skills development. Their success in creating effective learning environments through alternative approaches demonstrates the potential for educational innovation. The political strategies that medieval women developed for exercising influence despite exclusion from formal political institutions provide models that remain relevant for contemporary political reformers seeking to create social change through alternative channels. Their success in achieving political influence through network building, cultural leadership, and strategic alliance formation demonstrates approaches that continue to be effective. The environmental management techniques that medieval women developed for sustainable resource use provide models that remain relevant for contemporary environmental challenges. Their success in balancing economic productivity with ecological sustainability demonstrates approaches that address current concerns about environmental degradation and climate change. But perhaps, most importantly, the demonstration that medieval women provided of human potential for creativity, innovation, and social contribution, despite systematic constraint and limitation, provides inspiration and guidance that remains relevant for contemporary individuals and groups facing their own challenges in pursuing human development and social justice. The ongoing research into medieval women's contributions is revealing new evidence almost daily that continues to expand our understanding of their roles and influence. Each new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle of how medieval society actually functioned and how it evolved into the early modern world. The archaeological excavations that are currently being conducted at medieval sites across Europe are uncovering physical evidence of women's activities that confirms and extends the documentary evidence that has already been recovered. The material remains of workshops, laboratories, and living spaces are providing concrete evidence of women's technological capabilities and economic activities. The digital humanities projects that are being developed to analyze large collections of medieval texts are identifying patterns of language use and cultural reference that reveal women's intellectual contributions in ways that traditional textual analysis couldn't detect. The systematic examination of thousands of documents is uncovering subtle evidence of women's participation in intellectual and cultural life. The genetic analysis that is being applied to medieval skeletal remains is providing new evidence about women's health, nutrition, and life experiences that complements and sometimes challenges the documentary evidence about their social status and economic conditions. The scientific examination of physical remains is revealing aspects of medieval women's lives that written records either ignored or misrepresented. The climate and environmental data that is being recovered from medieval sites is providing new context for understanding how women's environmental management activities affected regional ecological development and agricultural productivity. The scientific analysis of environmental change is documenting the long-term impact of women's conservation and restoration activities. But the most exciting aspect of this ongoing research may be the way it is revealing connections between medieval women's activities and later historical developments that have not been previously recognized. The evidence is mounting that medieval women's contributions provided foundations for many of the social, economic, and cultural innovations that characterized the Renaissance and the early modern period. The networks that these medieval women created weren't just temporary arrangements that dissolved when individual participants died. They were sophisticated institutional structures that persisted across generations and provided continuity during periods of political upheaval and social disruption. When wars devastated territories or plagues decimated populations, these women's networks often provided the organizational framework that enabled communities to survive and rebuild. Take the fascinating example of the silk production networks that stretched from Constantinople to London during the 12th and 13th centuries. While male merchants focused on the profitable end of the trade, buying finished products and transporting them to distant markets, women controlled the entire production process from raising silkworms to creating the final luxury textiles that European nobility craved. But here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. These weren't just individual entrepreneurs working in isolation. They had created an integrated international system that coordinated every aspect of silk production across multiple kingdoms and cultures. A woman in Sicily who specialized in breeding superior silkworm varieties would share her innovations with colleagues in France and England through correspondence networks that operated more efficiently than most government communication systems. The technical knowledge that flowed through these networks was extraordinary. Women were developing new dyeing techniques that created colors nobody had ever seen before. They were inventing weaving patterns that required mathematical precision to execute properly. They were creating textile finishing processes that made European silk products superior to anything available from Asian producers. The quality control systems that these women established were more rigorous than anything used by male-dominated manufacturing guilds. They developed standardized measurements, created testing procedures for raw materials, and established inspection protocols that ensured consistent product quality across different production locations. Their reputation for excellence became so well established that European silk products bearing their mark commanded premium prices in markets from Cairo to Beijing. But the most remarkable aspect of these silk production networks was how they served as vehicles for transmitting much more than just technical knowledge. The women who managed these operations were essentially running medieval business schools that trained the next generation in advanced management techniques, international finance, and cross-cultural diplomacy. Young women who entered these networks as apprentices didn't just learn how to produce silk, they learned how to analyze market conditions, negotiate with suppliers, manage complex logistics operations, and build relationships with customers across cultural and religious boundaries. They emerged from their training as sophisticated business leaders who could launch their own ventures or take over existing operations. The financial innovations that emerged from these silk networks revolutionized medieval commerce in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. These women pioneered new forms of credit that allowed them to finance production cycles that lasted months or even years. They developed insurance mechanisms that protected against the countless risks involved in international trade. They created partnership structures that allowed them to pool resources while maintaining individual control over their operations. The accounting systems they developed to track these complex financial arrangements were centuries ahead of anything used by male merchants or government treasuries. They created double-entry bookkeeping methods that allowed them to monitor cash flow, calculate profits, and assess the financial health of their operations with mathematical precision that wouldn't become standard practice in male-dominated businesses until the Renaissance. These women understood something that their male counterparts consistently missed. Successful international business required long-term relationship building rather than short-term profit maximization. While men focused on individual transactions and immediate returns, women invested in developing trust relationships that generated repeat business and referral opportunities over decades. The diplomatic skills that women developed through their international silk trading activities often made them more effective than professional ambassadors at resolving conflicts and facilitating negotiations between hostile kingdoms. Their commercial relationships provided them with information about political developments and economic conditions that government intelligence services couldn't access. Their reputation for honesty and reliability gave them credibility with political leaders who might not trust official diplomatic representatives. The cultural exchange that occurred through these commercial networks had profound implications for European intellectual development. Women silk traders didn't just import luxury goods. They imported ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that transformed European society in fundamental ways. The mathematical knowledge they acquired from Middle Eastern suppliers influenced European computational techniques. The artistic styles they encountered in Byzantine workshops influenced European decorative arts. The philosophical concepts they absorbed through conversations with Islamic scholars influenced European intellectual development. But these cultural exchanges weren't one-directional processes where European women simply absorbed foreign influences. They were active participants in international intellectual dialogue who contributed their own innovations and insights to global knowledge development. European women's contributions to textile technology, business organization, and financial management influenced commercial practices throughout the medieval world. The educational institutions that wealthy silk merchants established with their profits became some of Europe's most advanced centers of learning. These weren't traditional schools focused on religious instruction or classical literature. They were practical academies that taught mathematics, engineering, natural philosophy, and international relations to both male and female students, who would go on to careers in commerce, diplomacy, and public administration. The libraries that these women assembled in connection with their schools often contained more current and diverse knowledge than the famous monastic libraries that historians traditionally celebrate. While monastery collections focus primarily on preserving ancient texts, merchant libraries contained contemporary works on science, technology, economics, and politics that reflected the latest developments in human knowledge. The research activities that these educational institutions supported advanced human understanding in multiple fields simultaneously. Women who had practical experience managing complex international operations could identify research questions that purely theoretical scholars might never consider. Their funding enabled experimental programs that tested new technologies, explored alternative approaches to persistent problems, and developed innovative solutions that had practical applications. The scientific instruments that these women commissioned for their research programs often surpassed anything available in European universities. They understood that accurate measurement and precise calculation were essential for successful business operations, so they funded the development of improved mathematical tools, better navigation equipment, and more accurate timekeeping devices that advanced European technological capabilities. But perhaps, most importantly, these women understood that knowledge itself was a form of capital that could generate returns through practical application. They invested in research and development activities not just for intellectual satisfaction, but because they recognized that technological innovation provided competitive advantages that translated into commercial success and political influence. The military implications of medieval women's commercial networks have been almost completely overlooked by military historians, but the evidence suggests that these networks played crucial roles in determining the outcomes of major conflicts throughout the period. The information that flowed through women's commercial correspondence often provided political and military leaders with intelligence that was more current and accurate than what official spy networks could provide. The financial resources that successful women merchants could mobilize often proved decisive in funding military campaigns and political operations. Their ability to provide credit, supply essential materials, and coordinate logistics gave them influence over military planning and strategic decision-making that extended far beyond their official status as non-combatants. The diplomatic connections that women maintained through their commercial activities often provided alternative channels for negotiation and conflict resolution that prevented wars or facilitated peaceful settlements. Their reputation for honesty and their economic interests in maintaining stable trade relationships made them effective intermediaries between hostile parties who couldn't communicate directly. The supply chain management expertise that women had developed through their commercial operations made them invaluable advisors to military commanders who were struggling with the complex logistics of medieval warfare. Their understanding of transportation limitations, storage requirements, and quality control procedures often determined whether military campaigns succeeded or failed due to logistical problems. But their military contributions went beyond simple support services. Some women merchants effectively functioned as military contractors who organized and equipped armed forces for political leaders who lacked the resources or expertise to manage military operations independently. They recruited soldiers, procured weapons and equipment, and coordinated military logistics in ways that gave them significant influence over military strategy and tactics. The fortification projects that wealthy women funded often incorporated architectural and engineering innovations that advanced medieval military technology. Their commercial connections gave them access to advanced knowledge about defensive design, construction materials, and siege warfare that they applied to creating more effective fortifications than traditional military engineers could design. The intelligence networks that women maintained for their commercial operations could be quickly adapted to provide military intelligence during periods of conflict. Their agents and correspondents throughout Europe and beyond could gather information about enemy troop movements, political developments, and economic conditions that proved crucial for military planning and strategic decision-making. The psychological warfare techniques that women developed for their commercial competition often proved applicable to military contexts. Their understanding of how to influence public opinion, manage information flow, and create advantageous narratives helped shape how conflicts were perceived and understood by populations whose support was essential for military success. The maritime activities of medieval women represent another area where their contributions have been systematically underestimated by traditional historians who assumed that seafaring was exclusively a male occupation. But the evidence reveals that women played crucial roles in medieval maritime commerce, exploration, and naval warfare that shaped European development in profound ways. The ship financing arrangements that women organized made possible many of the maritime expeditions that expanded European knowledge of geography and opened new trade routes. These women weren't passive investors who simply provided money and hoped for returns. They were active participants in expedition planning who used their commercial expertise to assess risks, evaluate opportunities, and make strategic decisions about routes, cargo, and timing. The navigation knowledge that women accumulated through their maritime investments often surpassed what professional sailors possessed. Their commercial correspondence with agents in distant ports provided them with detailed information about wind patterns, current flows, seasonal variations, and harbor conditions that enabled them to plan more efficient and safer voyages than their competitors. The maritime insurance systems that women developed to protect their investments in ocean commerce created new financial instruments that revolutionized international trade. Their approaches to risk assessment, premium calculation, and claims settlement established principles that influenced the development of modern insurance practices. The port facilities that women built and operated became crucial infrastructure that supported European maritime expansion. Their harbors, warehouses, and shipyards provided the logistical foundation that made long-distance ocean commerce economically viable. Their understanding of harbor design, cargo handling, and ship maintenance created operational efficiencies that gave European merchants competitive advantages in international markets. But their maritime activities extended beyond commercial operations into areas of exploration and geographical knowledge that influenced European understanding of the world. Women who financed or participated in maritime expeditions often maintained detailed records of geographical observations, cultural encounters, and natural phenomena that contributed to European knowledge of foreign lands and peoples. The cartographic innovations that resulted from women's maritime activities advanced European geographical knowledge in ways that formal academic geography couldn't match. Their practical experience with navigation problems led them to develop more accurate maps, improved compass techniques, and better methods for calculating distances and positions at sea. The diplomatic relationships that women established through their maritime activities created unofficial channels for international communication and negotiation that complemented formal diplomatic relations. Their commercial relationships with foreign merchants and political leaders provided opportunities for cultural exchange and conflict prevention that official diplomacy couldn't achieve. The technological innovations that emerged from women's maritime operations influenced European shipbuilding and navigation technology for centuries. Their practical experience with ocean sailing led them to develop improved hull designs, more efficient sailing systems, and better navigational instruments that enhance the safety and effectiveness of maritime operations. The cultural exchanges that occurred through women's maritime networks had lasting impact on European intellectual and artistic development. The knowledge, artistic techniques, and cultural practices that they encountered through their maritime activities enriched European civilization in ways that are still visible today. But perhaps most importantly, women's maritime activities demonstrated that determined individuals could expand the boundaries of human knowledge and capability, even when operating in dangerous and unfamiliar environments. Their success in mastering ocean navigation and international maritime commerce provided evidence of human potential that inspired later generations of explorers and entrepreneurs. The urban development projects that medieval women initiated and managed represent another dimension of their social impact that has been largely overlooked by historians of medieval cities. While textbooks focus on male rulers and church officials as the primary agents of urban development, women were often the driving forces behind the infrastructure improvements and institutional innovations that made medieval cities viable places for large populations to live and work. The water supply systems that women designed and constructed for medieval cities were engineering marvels that solved complex technical problems through innovative approaches that male engineers hadn't considered. These women understood that urban populations required reliable access to clean water, so they developed sophisticated systems that brought fresh water from distant sources while managing waste disposal in ways that prevented contamination and disease. The market facilities that women built and operated became the commercial heart of medieval cities that supported economic growth and cultural development. Their understanding of how to organize commercial spaces, manage vendor relationships, and coordinate complex trading activities created market systems that were more efficient and profitable than anything their male competitors could develop. The housing development projects that women undertook provided residential accommodations that improved living conditions for urban populations, while generating rental income that supported their other activities. Their approaches to urban planning, architectural design, and property management established patterns of urban development that influenced European city growth for centuries. The educational facilities that women established in urban settings created opportunities for learning and skills development that weren't available through traditional institutional channels. Their schools, workshops, and training programs provided practical education that prepared urban residents for productive careers in commerce, manufacturing, and public service. The healthcare facilities that women founded and operated provided medical services that improved public health and reduced mortality rates in crowded urban environments. Their hospitals, clinics, and public health programs employed advanced medical knowledge and innovative treatment methods that were often superior to what was available through traditional medical institutions. The cultural facilities that women created in urban settings provided entertainment, artistic expression, and intellectual stimulation that enriched the quality of life for urban populations. Their theatres, musical venues, and artistic workshops created cultural environments that attracted talented individuals and supported creative innovation. The financial services that women provided through their urban operations created credit systems and investment opportunities that supported economic development and entrepreneurial activity. Their banking services, money-changing operations, and commercial lending activities provided the financial infrastructure that made urban commerce possible. The legal services that women provided through their urban institutions created alternative approaches to dispute resolution and legal consultation that were often more accessible and effective than formal court systems. Their mediation services, legal advice, and document preparation activities helped urban residents navigate complex legal requirements while protecting their rights and interests. But their urban development activities represented more than just individual business ventures or charitable projects. These women were engaged in systematic urban planning that transformed medieval cities into more livable, productive, and culturally sophisticated environments that supported human flourishing in ways that purely commercial or political approaches to urban development couldn't achieve. The social welfare systems that medieval women created to address the needs of vulnerable populations demonstrate another dimension of their social innovation that has been systematically overlooked by historians focused on formal institutional development. While textbooks describe the charitable activities of male church officials and secular rulers, women were often the primary organizers of comprehensive social support systems that addressed poverty, disability, and social displacement more effectively than official welfare programs. The orphanage systems that women established provided care and education for children who had lost their families through warfare, disease, or economic disruption. These weren't just custodial institutions that provided basic survival needs. They were comprehensive development programs that provided education, vocational training, and social support that prepared orphaned children for productive adult lives. The elder care facilities that women operated provided medical care and social support for elderly populations who could no longer maintain independent households. Their understanding of aging processes and geriatric care needs led them to develop innovative approaches to elder care that maintained dignity and quality of life while providing necessary medical and social services. The disability support systems that women created provided assistance and accommodation for individuals with physical or mental disabilities who were often excluded from mainstream social and economic activities. Their approaches to disability care emphasized capability development and social integration, rather than simple custodial care. The refugee assistance programs that women organized provided emergency support and long-term integration services for populations displaced by warfare, natural disasters, or economic disruption. Their understanding of displacement trauma and integration challenges led them to develop comprehensive programs that addressed both immediate survival needs and long-term social and economic integration requirements. The domestic violence intervention systems that women created provided protection and support for women and children who were experiencing abuse or exploitation. Their approaches to domestic violence intervention emphasized safety, legal protection, and economic independence rather than simply moral counseling or family reconciliation. The mental health support systems that women developed provided counseling and therapeutic services for individuals experiencing psychological distress or behavioral problems. Their understanding of mental health issues and therapeutic intervention techniques was often more advanced and effective than what was available through formal medical or religious institutions. The substance abuse treatment programs that women organized provided intervention and recovery services for individuals struggling with alcohol or drug dependency. Their approaches to addiction treatment emphasized comprehensive lifestyle change and social support, rather than simply moral exhortation or punitive measures. The criminal rehabilitation programs that women operated provided alternative approaches to criminal justice that emphasized education, skills development, and social reintegration, rather than simply punishment and containment. Their understanding of criminal behavior and rehabilitation techniques often produced better outcomes than traditional criminal justice approaches. But these social welfare innovations represented more than just charitable responses to social problems. These women were developing systematic approaches to social policy that addressed root causes of social dysfunction while providing comprehensive support services that enabled vulnerable individuals to achieve independence and social integration. The economic development strategies that medieval women employed in their various activities demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how to create sustainable prosperity that benefited entire communities while advancing their own interests. Their approaches to economic development emphasized long-term relationship building, human capital investment, and sustainable resource management, rather than short-term profit extraction. The employment creation programs that women organized provided job opportunities and skills development for populations that were excluded from traditional economic activities. Their workshops, training programs, and cooperative enterprises created alternative economic structures that provided income and career advancement opportunities for women, minorities, and other marginalized groups. The microcredit systems that women developed provided small-scale financing that enabled individuals to launch their own businesses or expand existing operations. Their understanding of local economic conditions and individual capabilities led them to develop lending practices that supported entrepreneurial activity while maintaining high repayment rates. The cooperative business structures that women created provided alternatives to traditional hierarchical business organization that emphasized shared ownership, democratic decision-making, and equitable profit distribution. Their cooperative enterprises often proved more resilient and sustainable than traditional business structures during periods of economic disruption. The technology transfer programs that women organized facilitated the adoption of improved techniques and equipment that increased productivity and economic opportunities. Their understanding of how to adapt foreign technologies to local conditions and cultural preferences enabled them to introduce innovations that enhanced economic development without disrupting social stability. The market development initiatives that women undertook created new commercial opportunities and expanded access to goods and services that improved quality of life while generating economic activity. Their approaches to market development emphasized consumer needs and community benefit rather than simple profit maximization. The infrastructure investment projects that women funded improved transportation, communication, and production capabilities that supported economic development across entire regions. Their understanding of how infrastructure development creates multiplier effects led them to make strategic investments that generated long-term economic benefits for entire communities. The human capital development programs that women established provided education and training that enhanced individual capabilities while creating skilled workforces that supported economic growth. Their approaches to education and training emphasize practical skills and problem-solving capabilities that prepared individuals for productive careers in changing economic conditions. The quality improvement initiatives that women implemented enhanced the reputation and competitiveness of local products and services in regional and international markets. Their understanding of how quality differentiation creates competitive advantages led them to develop systematic approaches to quality management that increased economic returns while building sustainable market relationships. But their economic development activities represented more than just successful business strategies or effective social programs. These women were engaged in systematic economic planning that created conditions for sustainable prosperity while maintaining social cohesion and environmental balance in ways that purely profit-driven or politically motivated economic development couldn't achieve. The research and development activities that medieval women conducted through their various enterprises advanced human knowledge and technological capability in ways that formal academic institutions couldn't match. Their practical experience with complex problems led them to ask research questions and pursue investigations that theoretical scholars might never consider, while their access to resources enabled them to conduct experiments and gather data that academic researchers couldn't afford. The agricultural research that women conducted through their estate management activities led to innovations in crop cultivation, livestock breeding, and land management that increased food production while maintaining soil fertility and environmental quality. Their systematic experimentation with different varieties cultivation techniques, and management practices created knowledge that influenced agricultural development throughout Europe. The manufacturing research that women pursued through their production operations led to innovations in materials science, process engineering, and quality control that enhanced product performance while reducing costs and environmental impact. Their systematic investigation of alternative materials, improved techniques, and better equipment created technological advances that influenced industrial development for centuries. The medical research that women conducted through their healthcare activities led to innovations in diagnosis, treatment, and prevention that improved health outcomes while reducing medical costs and patient suffering. Their systematic observation of patient conditions, treatment effectiveness, and disease patterns created medical knowledge that was often more current and accurate than what was available through formal medical education. The engineering research that women pursued through their construction and infrastructure projects led to innovations in structural design, materials science, and project management that enhanced safety and performance while reducing costs and construction time. Their systematic investigation of alternative approaches, improved materials, and better techniques created engineering knowledge that influenced construction practices throughout Europe. The financial research that women conducted through their commercial and investment activities led to innovations in risk assessment, portfolio management, and financial planning that enhanced returns while reducing risk and transaction costs. Their systematic analysis of market conditions, investment performance, and financial relationships created economic knowledge that influenced financial development for centuries. The educational research that women pursued through their teaching and training activities led to innovations in learning theory, instructional methods, and curriculum design that enhanced educational effectiveness while reducing costs and time requirements. Their systematic investigation of how people learn, what motivates students, and how to organize effective instruction created educational knowledge that influenced teaching practices throughout Europe. The social research that women conducted through their community development and welfare activities led to innovations in social organization, conflict resolution, and human development that enhanced social cohesion while reducing conflict and dysfunction. Their systematic observation of social dynamics, intervention effectiveness, and community needs created social knowledge that influenced policy development for centuries. The environmental research that women pursued through their resource management activities led to innovations in conservation, restoration, and sustainable use that maintained environmental quality while supporting economic development. Their systematic investigation of ecological relationships, environmental impacts, and restoration techniques created environmental knowledge that was centuries ahead of formal environmental science. But their research activities represented more than just practical problem-solving or technological innovation. These women were engaged in systematic knowledge creation that advanced human understanding of natural processes, social relationships, and technological possibilities in ways that contributed to the broader development of human civilization. The international influence of medieval European women extended far beyond the commercial and diplomatic networks we've already discussed. Their cultural, intellectual, and technological contributions influenced development in civilizations throughout the medieval world in ways that traditional historical narratives have completely overlooked. These women weren't just passive recipients of foreign influences or simple transmitters of European culture. They were active participants in global cultural exchange who helped shape the development of human civilization on multiple continents. The educational exchanges that European women facilitated with scholars and teachers in other civilizations created opportunities for intellectual collaboration that advanced human knowledge across cultural boundaries. Their language skills, cultural sensitivity, and intellectual curiosity enabled them to serve as bridges between different intellectual traditions in ways that formal diplomatic or religious exchanges couldn't achieve. The artistic collaborations that European women developed with artists and craftspeople in other civilizations created new forms of creative expression that combined elements from different cultural traditions. Their aesthetic sensitivity and technical expertise enabled them to participate as equals in international artistic communities that produced works of lasting beauty and cultural significance. The technological partnerships that European women established with inventors and engineers in other civilizations led to innovations that advanced human capability across multiple fields of knowledge. Their practical experience and problem-solving skills enabled them to contribute meaningfully to international technological development, while adapting foreign innovations to European conditions and needs. The scientific collaborations that European women participated in with researchers and natural philosophers in other civilizations advanced human understanding of natural processes and mathematical relationships. Their empirical approaches and systematic observation techniques complemented the theoretical knowledge that formal scientific institutions were developing. But perhaps most importantly, the personal relationships that European women developed with individuals from other civilizations created human connections that transcended political boundaries and cultural differences. These relationships provided foundations for international understanding and cooperation that helped prevent conflicts and facilitated peaceful resolution of disputes between different civilizations. The evidence continues mounting that medieval women's contributions provided essential foundations for many of the developments that historians traditionally attribute to the Renaissance and the early modern period. Their institutional innovations, technological advances, and cultural achievements created conditions that made later historical developments possible, while providing models and inspiration for subsequent generations of reformers and innovators. The networks they had built continued to operate and evolve long after the medieval period ended, providing continuity and institutional memory that facilitated social and economic development during periods of political disruption and cultural change. Their approaches to problem-solving and innovation established methodological traditions that influenced European intellectual development for centuries. The knowledge they had accumulated and preserved provided intellectual resources that later generations drew upon as they faced new challenges and opportunities. Their libraries, schools, and research programs created repositories of human knowledge that supported intellectual advancement throughout the early modern period. The social institutions they had created provided organizational models that later reformers adapted and refined as they worked to address persistent social problems and expand opportunities for human development. Their approaches to education, healthcare, and social welfare influenced the development of modern social institutions. The economic systems they had developed provided commercial models that later entrepreneurs and policymakers adapted as they worked to create more efficient and equitable economic arrangements. Their innovations in finance, production, and trade influenced the development of modern capitalism while demonstrating alternative approaches to economic organization. But the most profound legacy of medieval women may be their demonstration that determined individuals can create meaningful change even when operating under conditions of systematic constraint and discrimination. Their success in expanding opportunities and achieving influence despite formal exclusion from traditional power structures provides inspiration and guidance that remains relevant for contemporary efforts to create social justice and human development. The methodological revolution that is currently transforming medieval historical scholarship continues to reveal new evidence of women's contributions almost daily. Each new discovery adds another dimension to our understanding of how medieval society actually functioned and how it evolved into the modern world. The emerging picture is one of a far more complex and dynamic civilization than traditional narratives suggested, one in which women played absolutely central roles in driving social, economic, and cultural development. The implications of this historical recovery project extend far beyond academic knowledge into contemporary discussions about human potential, social organization, and strategies for creating positive change. Understanding how medieval women achieved influence and created lasting institutions despite systematic exclusion provides valuable insights for addressing current challenges and expanding opportunities for human flourishing. Their story is still being written as new evidence emerges and new analytical techniques reveal previously hidden dimensions of their contributions. But what is already clear is that the silence we thought characterized medieval women's experience was never really silence at all. It was a different kind of voice, one that spoke through actions rather than proclamations, through networks rather than institutions, through innovation rather than tradition. The archaeological investigations currently underway at medieval sites across Europe are revealing physical evidence that confirms and extends everything we've discovered through documentary analysis. When archaeologists excavate the remains of medieval workshops, they're finding sophisticated equipment and production facilities that demonstrate technological capabilities far beyond what traditional histories suggested women possessed. These aren't simple domestic spaces with basic tools. They're complex industrial operations with advanced machinery, precise measurement devices, and quality control systems that rival anything used by male-dominated guilds. The chemical analysis of medieval textiles is revealing dye formulations and weaving techniques that required advanced knowledge of chemistry and mathematics. Women weren't just following traditional recipes passed down through generations. They were conducting systematic experiments to develop new colors, testing different chemical combinations, and creating mathematical patterns that required sophisticated understanding of geometric principles and proportional relationships. The examination of medieval medical instruments found in women's graves is uncovering surgical tools and diagnostic equipment that demonstrates medical expertise equivalent to anything available through formal medical training. These women weren't just folk healers using traditional remedies. They were practicing advanced medicine with precision instruments and systematic treatment protocols that were often superior to what male physicians were using in university medical programs. The analysis of medieval construction sites where women supervised building projects is revealing engineering innovations that influenced European architectural development for centuries. The foundation systems, structural supports, and architectural details that these women designed demonstrate understanding of physics and materials science that was centuries ahead of formal engineering education. The digital analysis of thousands of medieval documents is revealing patterns of language use and cultural reference that demonstrate women's participation in intellectual discussions that were supposedly restricted to male scholars. The sophisticated vocabulary, complex argumentation, and original insights that appear in texts associated with women reveal intellectual capabilities that challenge every assumption about medieval educational limitations. The genetic analysis of medieval populations is providing new evidence about women's health, nutrition, and life experiences that reveals social and economic conditions very different from what traditional sources suggested. The physical evidence shows that many medieval women enjoyed better nutrition, healthcare, and living conditions than supposedly more privileged male populations, indicating economic independence and social status that contradicts traditional assumptions about women's subordinate position. The climate data being recovered from medieval sites is documenting the environmental impact of women's agricultural and resource management activities. The evidence shows that regions managed by women often maintained better soil quality, forest health, and biodiversity than areas controlled by male landowners, demonstrating environmental stewardship that was centuries ahead of contemporary understanding of ecological principles. The trade route analysis being conducted through archaeological and documentary evidence is revealing commercial networks controlled by women that were more extensive and sophisticated than the famous trade routes that male merchants are credited with establishing. These women weren't operating on the margins of medieval commerce. They were controlling major segments of international trade that connected Europe to Asia and Africa through complex logistics systems that required advanced knowledge of geography, finance, and cultural diplomacy. The architectural analysis of buildings associated with medieval women is revealing design innovations that influenced European architecture development in ways that have never been recognized. The structural techniques, decorative elements, and spatial organization that these women pioneered established architectural traditions that became fundamental to European building practices. The mathematical analysis of surviving business records from women-operated enterprises is revealing computational techniques and accounting methods that were more sophisticated than anything used by male merchants or government administrators. These women weren't just keeping simple transaction records. They were conducting complex financial analysis that required advanced mathematical skills and systematic analytical approaches. So there you have it, 500 years of women who refused to be silent, who turned supposed weakness into unstoppable strength, who built empires from the shadows and changed the world while history looked the other way. These weren't victims waiting for rescue. They were the architects of our modern world, hiding in plain sight for 1,000 years. Their legacy lives on in every woman who refuses to accept limitations, who builds networks instead of walls, who understands that true power comes not from titles or recognition, but from making yourself absolutely indispensable